As the autumn of 1415 approaches, one of the defining battles of the 100 Years' War is about to unfold. Driven by dynastic ambition and the need to secure his legitimacy, the young Henry V of Lancaster lays claim to the crown of France. Across the Channel, the French kingdom is in disarray, its rulers struck by madness, while civil war tears the realm apart, the perfect moment for Henry to seek glory on the battlefield. What was the true tactical effect of massed longbow shooting on the advancing French lines? Why are the estimates of English numbers at Agincourt so divisive? And why can no single account be trusted for certain? And why did no one condemn Henry for executing prisoners, despite his breach of the chivalric code? This is the Battle of Agincourt, the full picture. Henry V of Lancaster ascended the English throne on April 9, 1413, at the age of 26. From the plays of William Shakespeare, we learn of Henry's wild, reckless youth and his dramatic transformation into a righteous king. But the actual history tells a markedly different tale. Henry had fought alongside his father at the Battle of Shrewsbury, where he sustained a near-fatal wound to the face. He led the suppression of Owain Glyndwr's rebellion in Wales. He conducted negotiations with the Armagnacs and Burgundians, the opposing factions in the French Civil War. And finally, he presided over the royal council as his father's health declined. By 1413, Henry had thus become a highly accomplished statesman, renowned for his sharp intellect, unwavering determination, and extensive experience in matters of war and governance. The new king's ambitions were intertwined with deep-seated anxieties regarding his claim to the throne. His father's usurpation of power and the subsequent murder of Richard II had inflicted a profound wound on England, one that continued to fester, undermining the legitimacy of the new Lancastrian dynasty. Henry desperately needed to reassert his authority, and he knew a perfect means to do so: war. In the spring of 1414, the young Lancaster unleashed a wave of political and economic demands upon the court of the ailing Charles VI. Henry's envoys reminded the French government of the partially unpaid ransom for King Jean II, captured at the Battle of Poitiers. They demanded the return of Aquitaine, Anjou, Maine, and Normandy, as well as the crown of France itself, which they claimed rightfully belonged to the legitimate heir of the last Capetians, meaning Henry V of England, not the Valois usurpers. Furthermore, Lancaster sought the hand of Catherine of France, daughter of Charles VI, so that his future son might inherit both kingdoms. The French nobility's intense internal struggle, which persisted even in the face of foreign threat, coupled with the economic devastation wrought by feudal strife and Charles VI's madness, emboldened the English envoys, who quickly resorted to threats and ultimatums. In February 1415, the English king severed diplomatic ties with France. He openly proclaimed his intention to forcefully reclaim his rightful French inheritance, declared the French government responsible for the impending war, and began mobilizing his invasion forces. In the age of Henry V, raising an army was a challenging and costly endeavor. The old practice of summoning feudal levies had by now become obsolete, replaced by a more advanced contractual system. A written agreement was drawn up on the king's behalf with the captain of a free company to be enlisted for military service. This document stipulated all crucial details: the term, location, and conditions of service, the composition and size of the company, as well as wages, provisions, bonuses, and much more. To prevent forgery, the contract was drafted in duplicate on a single sheet of paper, which was then cut in half with a serrated line. allowing the two parts to be matched and verified for authenticity. Consequently, the English contract gained the name indenture due to its indented edge. Fortunately, most of the 1415 campaign indentures have survived in archives, enabling Professor Anne Curry of the University of Southampton to estimate the English army's strength with remarkable precision. Her research included the tally of soldiers enlisted by captains of various feudal ranks, as well as those provided directly by the crown. Curry concluded that Henry V commanded nearly 12,000 men for his French campaign, with a minimum of 11,200 troops confirmed by archival records. Accompanying them were around 600 support personnel, including armorers, masons, fletchers, bowyers, and for the first time in English history, field surgeons. On August 11th, the invasion fleet, comprising at least 300 ships, set sail for France. Henry's initial objective was to seize control of Harfleur, a vital French port on the Atlantic coast and a crucial gateway to Normandy. The English army landed near Harfleur unopposed, but the siege of the town devolved into a grueling ordeal that stretched on for 5 weeks. Henry's forces suffered significant casualties due to a dysentery epidemic, while Harfleur was nearly reduced to rubble by relentless English bombardment. Never getting any help from the outside, Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22, 1415. The king ordered news of Harfleur's successful capture to be dispatched to London, yet from a strategic standpoint, it was a hollow victory. Henry had lost the military initiative, allowing the French to amass a sizable army in Normandy within a month. Meanwhile, his own forces dwindled. Estimates of Henry's losses at Harfleur range from 1,500 to 6,000 men. In any case, the expedition could have been concluded, and yet the king did not even consider it. Instead, he informed his captains that they would march to Calais. Much ink has been spilled to explain why Henry embarked on this recklessly bold endeavor. Clearly, he had no intention of provoking the French into a field battle. Had that been his aim, he could have simply advanced on Rouen, where the French army was assembling. Nor was he interested in plunder, having strictly forbidden his soldiers from looting. The answer lies in Henry's royal will and his obsession with the divine right to traverse the lands he considered rightfully his. And should the French dare to engage him in battle, my trust is in my God, and they shall not hurt my army nor myself. I will not allow them, puffed up with pride, to rejoice in their misdeeds, nor unjustly against God to possess my goods. On Monday, October 8th, Henry's army departed from Harfleur. The initial 3 days of the march went smoothly. It was not until October 11th, at Arques, that the English forces encountered their first significant resistance. The Châtelaine of Arques initially refused to provide supplies, but eventually capitulated when Henry threatened to raze the town. The following day, a similar incident took place in the town of Eu, where, once again, the English obtained their demands. Meanwhile, the French were far from idle. The Marshal of France, Jean Boucicaut, shadowed the English king, while Constable Charles de Bray swiftly moved northeast, intending to block the Somme crossings. The skilled French commanders were not yet willing to engage Henry in direct combat, and their maneuvers displayed extraordinary caution. Upon reaching the Somme, the English encountered a problem. At the river's mouth lay a ford called Blanchetaque, which Edward III had used during his Crécy campaign nearly 7 decades earlier. This time, however, the French had fortified it by erecting rows of sharpened stakes and stationed a cavalry detachment to guard the approaches. Henry had no choice but to move his army upstream in search of an alternative crossing point. The English traveled almost 100 kilometers along the left bank, bypassing Abbeville and Amiens, only to find that every bridge had been destroyed, and that the French, under d'Albret's command, controlled every ford. By October 14th, a week into the march, English food supplies had dwindled to alarmingly low levels, forcing soldiers to survive on forest nuts, strawberries, and dried meat. To prevent a breakdown of discipline, Henry took drastic measures. In front of the entire army, he ordered the execution of a squire caught stealing from a church and prohibited the drinking of wine. And when an indulgent captain informed the king that soldiers were merely filling their bottles, Henry snapped. "Their bottles indeed! They're making big bottles of their bellies and getting terribly drunk!" Finally, taking advantage of the Some's bend, Henry outmaneuvered the French and successfully led his army to the right bank on October 19th. The French vanguard arrived here too late and was repelled after a brief skirmish. On the day the English crossed the Somme, French commanders gathered in Péronne for a war council. They decided to confront Henry in battle the following week. D'Albret's army was now in a favorable position, its strength swelling daily with the arrival of additional men-at-arms from Picardy. On October 22nd, the Duke of Brittany reached Amiens, leading a substantial force to join the French host. Crossbowmen and infantry levies were hastily mustered in Picardy's towns and dispatched to the Somme. More importantly, Henry's campaign led to a temporary reconciliation between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. Although Jean the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, did not rally under the royal banner and forbade his eldest son Philippe from leaving the duchy, he did not restrict his other vassals. As a result, many Burgundians would take part in the forthcoming battle alongside the Armagnacs. Jean's brother, Antoine, Duke of Brabant, answered the call to arms with particular enthusiasm. He passionately expressed his desire to fight the invaders and, on October 22nd, rushed forth with his followers in a hurried frenzy. To reach the battlefield in time, they had to cover 200 kilometers in just 4 days. Meanwhile, Henry V's army, formally challenged to battle by Constable d'Albret, marched past Péronne's walls in a desperate bid to reach Calais. The rain poured down relentlessly, leaving the English no option but to sleep in the wet. Leaving Péronne behind, they encountered a track of mud churned by what appeared to be thousands of hooves, as if an unimaginable specter had trampled the ground. The reality, however, was more mundane. It was the trail of the French army, which had advanced from Péronne and was now getting ready for a decisive engagement. On October 24th, the French army positioned itself between the villages of Tramcourt and Agincourt, blocking the English from reaching Calais. The English established their camp in the southern part of the valley, near the village of Maisoncelles. After an arduous 18-day march, the soldiers were thoroughly drenched, famished, and utterly exhausted. Men confessed their sins to one another if the lines to the priests grew too long, while armorers and bowers labored tirelessly through the night to prepare weapons for the impending battle. The French were no fools. They arrived at the battlefield with a clear plan, meticulously prepared in advance at Rouen. Discovered in 1984 at the British Library, this plan illuminates the tactical considerations of the French on the eve of Agincourt. It distilled the entire 70-year experience of the 100 Years' War, featuring a frontal assault by dismounted men-at-arms, a flanking cavalry charge against the archers, and a strike against the English supply train and rear. Yet the plan had a critical flaw. It overlooked the terrain's topography. The Agincourt battlefield was essentially a narrow corridor between two forested areas, spanning roughly 1,100 meters wide in the north and tapering to approximately 800 meters in the south. It was the French, not Henry V, who selected this location, as it allowed them to easily block the English advance toward Calais. However, it offered no other advantages. The limited space prevented the French from leveraging their superior numbers, while the dense forests shielded the sides of the English position, rendering flanking maneuvers virtually impossible. The atmosphere among the French commanders was tense. Constable d'Aubray and Marshal Boucicaut were the principal military officers of the crown. Yet at Agincourt, they found themselves outranked in feudal status by the 19-year-old Duke of Orléans. Charles was joined by the assertive Dukes of Alençon and Bourbon, both eager to contribute to the decision-making process. The primary issue at hand was whether to confront the English the following morning or to wait. d'Aubray and Boucicaut, along with other professional officers, advocated for the second option. The French army was continuously receiving reinforcements and had abundant supplies, while the English forces grew increasingly exhausted and hungry. Delaying the battle could further weaken the enemy physically and undermine their already low morale. However, the Dukes of Bourbon and Alençon vehemently opposed any delay. Firmly believing in an effortless victory, they even went so far as to accuse the other captains of cowardice. In the end, it was their perspective that prevailed. At dawn on October 25th, the day celebrated in the church calendar as the Feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, the French assumed their designated positions. Two infantry battles formed the backbone of the French line. The first battle, composed largely of noble elites, held the frontal position, while the second, smaller in size, was positioned behind. The constable, the marshal, and nearly all prominent nobles took their places in the army's vanguard. Flanking the main force were two cavalry units, one under the command of the Count of Vendôme and the other led by Cligny de Brabant. Their primary objective was to swiftly engage and scatter the English archers in the initial stages of the battle, clearing the path for the infantry assault. The French had no definite plan for deploying the rest of their army. The rear guard received no instructions and lacked leadership because all its captains, including its commander, the Count of Marle, had abandoned their companies to fight in the vanguard. Initially, the plan was to concentrate crossbowmen on the flanks opposite the English archers, but the battlefield proved too narrow, and so they were sent to the rear. When the French army finally lined up in the field, it presented a truly intimidating sight. Yet, this menacing appearance masked a disorganized battle order and an almost complete lack of command hierarchy. Henry V also positioned his army between the two forests. His men-at-arms were stationed in the center, organized into three battles just 4 ranks deep, with no additional troops behind them. The king commanded the center. His cousin Edward, the Duke of York, led the right flank, while Thomas, Lord Camoys, was in charge of the left. Camoys, by then well into his 60s, was one of the few men present whose military experience dated back to the reign of Edward III. Sir Thomas Erpingham, another seasoned English veteran, commanded the archers. Following the conventional approach, Erpingham deployed them on the flanks, slightly ahead of the main force. Additionally, small groups of archers were positioned between the battalions of men-at-arms, while another 200 were concealed in the woods of Tramcourt to strike the French from the flank. Henry V had gained some intelligence about the French battle plan, likely from prisoners. Recognizing the threat posed by the French cavalry, he had instructed his archers to prepare sharp wooden stakes, each about 2 meters in length. These stakes were to be driven into the ground at an angle, with each one pointing upward towards the opponent's waist level. To prepare for a swift retreat if necessary, the English moved their baggage train, along with horses, non-combatants, and a small guard, to the rear of their lines. Henry himself, clad in magnificent armor with a golden crown adorning his helmet, took his position at the very center of the formation. Two conflicting perspectives exist on the English numbers at Agincourt. The conventional view holds that the English army comprised 900 men-at-arms and 5,000 archers, and that they were heavily outnumbered by the French. Critics argue this perspective is flawed, as it relies heavily on a single source, the Deeds of Henry V Chronicle, which is biased and presents the lowest figures compared to other English and Burgundian accounts. Professor Anne Curry proposed an alternative approach. Drawing from surviving administrative records, she argued that the English army at Agincourt consisted of approximately 9,000 troops, a much larger force than conventionally thought. However, her approach also drew criticism, as the administrative records were found to be incomplete, rendering them an unreliable foundation for any definitive conclusions. Currently, the numbers debate has reached an impasse, leaving us with two different versions. The French numbers are less contentious. Historians generally agree that the French fielded 8,000 to 10,000 men-at-arms at Agincourt. Disagreements arise when determining the number of archers, crossbowmen, servants, and militia, with estimates ranging from 4,000, Curry's approach, to over 20,000, the traditionalist approach. In a sense, these discrepancies mattered little. According to their own plan, the French intended to involve only the men-at-arms in the battle, which essentially leveled the playing field. The English battle strategy relied on a strong defensive position and assumed the French would attack first. Instead, the French stayed put in their original positions and waited to be attacked. At least 2 hours had lapsed before Henry decided to make the first move and delivered an inspirational speech to his troops. Primary sources provide conflicting accounts of his exact words. Undoubtedly, the king must have reminded his men of the righteousness of the English cause, divine support, and his own unwavering determination to fight to the death. At about 10 in the morning, Sir Thomas Erpingham, positioned in front of the archers, threw a baton into the air, signaling the advance. He also shouted the phrase, "Now strike," which is often misinterpreted as an order for the archers to begin shooting. Back then, it meant something akin to, "Now we shall fight." The order to advance banners resonated across the field. The English troops roared out their battle cry, and the entire army moved forward towards the French lines. Every few steps, they would stop to reorganize their formation, let out another shout, and then press on with their advance. As the English closed in on the French, the archers replanted their stakes and unleashed dense volleys of arrows upon the French positions. The detachment concealed in the woods joined the barrage. Surprisingly, the French were caught unprepared. Most men-at-arms from the cavalry units on the flanks had abandoned their posts during the morning calm and had not yet rejoined the formation. Guillaume de Saveuse, leading the left flank unit in the Count of Vendôme's absence, commanded a force of merely 300 men. On the right flank, Cligny de Brabant could muster just 160. Under the intense arrow barrage, the captains had no choice but to launch an immediate attack with whatever men they had. The French cavalry charge got off to a rocky start. The sheer numbers of English archers were too much for a small group of heavily armed horsemen to overpower. In addition, the French cavalrymen quickly discovered that the previous day's intense rainfall had transformed the freshly plowed field into a treacherous expanse of thick mud, severely impeding their horses' progress and causing frequent slips, stumbles, and falls. On the left flank, the men-at-arms under Guillaume de Saveuse barely reached the sharpened stakes. Halting their advance, they clustered before the barricade, becoming easy targets for the archers who released their arrows from up close. As for Guillaume de Saveuse, His horse ran into a firmly planted stake, propelling the rider over his mount's head to lie stunned and helpless at the feet of the English archers, where he was swiftly dispatched. The loss of their dashing commander must have disheartened his knights, precipitating their retreat. The archers continued to shoot at the fleeing enemy, driving the horses mad from wounds. A similar drama unfolded on the English line's right flank, where the wounded Cligny de Brebon retreated with his contingent. Simultaneously, the French launched another attack, originally planned as a surprise rear strike on the English forces. Isambard d'Agincourt, a local lord, along with a small group of horsemen and 600 peasants, silently passed through the forest and assaulted the English baggage train. As a result, he captured valuable treasures, including one of the king's crowns, a considerable amount of silver, and the royal sword embellished with exquisite gemstones. Nevertheless, the raid had almost no impact on the battle's outcome. Isambard made no attempt to strike the English from behind and, satisfied with the loot, withdrew into the forest. News of his raid would reach Henry's army several hours later, at a most inopportune moment. In the meantime, the two French infantry battalions commenced their relentless advance towards the enemy. Struggling through the mud and trying not to be trampled by the running horses, they found themselves at the mercy of the English archers, who unleashed volley after volley upon them. Shooting from the flanks forced the men-at-arms to lower their visors and gradually concentrate in the middle of their formation. Coupled with the features of the terrain, which narrowed towards the south, and the fervent desire of the French knights to confront the English king in person, this created a visible funneling effect. Chroniclers noted that the French vanguard was so tightly packed that the men-at-arms could hardly lift their weapons. Despite this, the French exhibited unwavering determination. They overcame these challenges and engaged the enemy with such overwhelming force that the English were pushed back several meters. The thin line of English men-at-arms miraculously held off the assault. Yet, instead of retreating, they promptly regrouped, pushing forward to regain the lost positions. As a brutal close-quarters battle raged in the center, the archers kept shooting at point-blank range, penetrating weak spots in the French armor. And when they ran out of arrows, which happened rather quickly, the archers cast their bows aside, taking up swords, daggers, and lead mallets with which they had planted the stakes. Bursting out from behind the barricade, they launched a merciless and ferocious assault on the French flanks and rear. The advancing masses exerted such immense pressure that the unfortunate Frenchmen who fell to the ground were either crushed by their compatriots or, unable to remove their visors, drowned in the mud. The English, too, were in a desperate state. The Duke of York, who led the right battalion, was killed along with a quarter of his soldiers. The king's brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, received a wound to the groin and collapsed in front of Henry. Shielding Humphrey with his own body, the king stood above him and repelled the assailants until his brother was carried away from the battlefield. Henry himself faced mortal danger. 18 knights from the Duke of Alençon's retinue vowed to either capture or kill the English king. In an unequal combat, the French fell one by one. Yet they diverted the attention of the royal bodyguards, allowing Jean d'Alençon to engage in a knightly duel with Henry V. The king received a crushing blow with an axe, which shattered one of the fleurs-de-lis from his golden crown and cracked his helmet. The next instant, the brave duke was knocked down by the English bodyguards and, despite his cry, "I am the Duke of Alençon, I surrender," was killed on the spot. With Alençon's death, France lost one of the prominent leaders of the Armagnac party. Throughout a grueling 3-hour carnage, the English soldiers mercilessly chopped, slashed, and stabbed their way through the French vanguard. The flower of French chivalry lay dead on the battlefield. Constable d'Albret perished. France's sacred banner, the oriflamme, was also lost in the heat of battle. Now the English felt confident enough to start taking prisoners. The Duke of Bourbon and Marshal Boucicaut were captured by English squires. Arthur de Richemont, the Duke of Brittany's brother, was found alive underneath 2 or 3 corpses. Charles of Orléans was discovered by English archers under similar circumstances. As the battle turned into a brutal slaughter, a cavalcade of weary horsemen rode onto the field. Unfortunately for him, Antoine, Duke of Brabant, arrived just in time to witness the scene of complete disaster. Refusing to stay idle, Antoine grabbed his lance and, having lost his surcoat, donned the banner of a trumpeter before fearlessly rushing into battle. Within minutes, his unit was crushed. Antoine was taken captive, but because of the banner, nobody recognized his true identity. The English spared him for the moment. The battle quieted down, leading Henry and his army to believe that they had secured victory. Moments later, alarm spread among the English as news started to circulate that the French were regrouping. It looked like the rear guard of the French forces was raising banners to launch a new offensive. Fragmented messages and rumors went around suggesting the potential arrival of the Dukes of Brittany and Anjou, a raid by Cligny de Brabant in the rear, or an attack on the supply train. Henry panicked. A man of such determination could not let victory slip away, especially when it seemed within his grasp. It was then that he gave the fateful order to execute the prisoners. Its purpose was twofold: forcing the remaining French troops to retreat and preventing a possible rebellion among the captives in case of another attack. Henry definitely broke the code of chivalry, but from a military standpoint, his actions could be considered justified. This explains why no contemporary chronicler condemned him for this decision. In any case, the act of killing the prisoners was an unprecedented display of savagery. A dagger to the throat or an axe to the head was all it took. Only those with the potential to fetch large ransoms were left unharmed, specifically the princes of royal blood, like the Duke of Orléans. The unrecognized Duke of Brabant, on the other hand, had no such protection and was brutally executed, like so many others. It was only when Henry realized that there was no threat from the French rearguard and he was pointlessly squandering money that he put an end to the slaughter. The French suffered a catastrophic defeat, as evidenced by the exceptionally large number of casualties. A total of 3 dukes, 5 counts, almost 100 noble lords, and 3,069 knights and men-at-arms fell on the battlefield. At least 2,600 more were found without arms to identify them. Most military officers of the crown were wiped out, except for Marshal Boucicaut, who was captured, and Admiral Cligny de Brabant, who escaped. The battle claimed the lives of almost an entire generation of nobles from Picardy, where most recruits had come from. The Duchy of Bourbon was later described as deprived of knights and squires on account of the Day of the English, at which most of them had been killed or captured. As for the English, the deaths of the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk were the most painful losses they endured. Payment records confirm the deaths of 3 other men-at-arms and 14 archers. Furthermore, there were 90 casualties among the Duke of York's retinue, though the exact proportion of archers to men-at-arms among them is unclear. The English likely suffered additional unrecorded losses, but not significantly more. In medieval battles, most casualties occurred during the final pursuit, as the wounded were finished off on the ground, rather than during the main engagement. The news of the defeat reached Rouen the next morning. The court was stunned. The king, the Dauphin, and the Duke of Berry wept. There is no path or lane, no town or village in France which does not feel the wound, wrote the young Norman poet Robert Blondel. The initial shock, however, soon gave way to indignation, and the public started blaming the French nobles for the defeat. It was generally attributed to their extravagant lifestyle, greed, blasphemy, violence against women, and, most importantly, the feudal conflicts that engulfed the kingdom after the assassination of Louis of Orleans. Interestingly enough, Henry V held a somewhat similar view. "I know that God by His grace has given me this victory not for any worth of mine, but to punish the French for their sins," Henry is said to have told his unfortunate captive Charles of Orleans, who was so devastated that he could neither eat nor drink. "For," Henry continued, "if I am rightfully informed, there has never been such disorder, hedonism, sinfulness, and vice as reigns in our time in France." Meanwhile, in England, the battle radically transformed public sentiment. Any doubts regarding the legitimacy of the Lancastrian dynasty were cast aside. The triumph at Agincourt convinced Henry's subjects that his French ambitions were not only just, but also divinely ordained and easily achievable. In a letter of congratulations sent to the king shortly after the battle, the Chancellor of the Kingdom, Henry Beaufort, compared Henry to figures like David, Solomon, and Alexander the Great. The winter of sloth and idleness, timidity and folly has passed away, and the spring flowers of youth and martial vigor are here. Beaufort wrote that the king could rest assured about financial matters, as he would receive all the necessary funds to complete his campaigns. As for the French prisoners, most of them had been released before the English left Calais. Typically, they were either ransomed for small amounts, set free on parole, or sold to ransom brokers. However, the most valuable and influential prisoners were brought to England. The Duke of Orleans and Bourbon, Arthur de Richemont, Marshal Boucicaut, and other nobles were accommodated in London with comfort and even allowed some freedom of movement. All of them, except for Boucicaut, were affluent men with enough means to soften the hardships of captivity. Charles of Orleans brought over a variety of items from France, including books, gold and silverware, chandeliers, as well as numerous servants who oversaw his French estates. The Duke of Bourbon, a man of simpler tastes, brought over his huntsmen and falconers, hawks and hounds, as well as shiploads of wine. None of this, however, could compensate for the boredom of confinement. The prominent political figures of France were left to watch impotently as historic events unfolded across the Channel. The Duke of Orleans was destined to remain in England for a quarter of a century. The poems he wrote in captivity are filled with overwhelming sorrow and melancholy regret for the lost years. "So closed are the eyes of my heart, asleep. In indifference they'll not ope again. For of beauty I do not dare or deign to speak as I did, but silence keep. I've learnt by heart all one may reap, for the book of joy I take up in vain. So closed are the eyes of my heart, asleep. In indifference they'll not ope again." Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, help others discover it too. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for the upcoming episodes. Until next time.